So what I would prefer, from the government side or the policymaker side, that if we can have one overarching agencies like Transnova of Norway, who is empowered and who is given the enough fund to support the new technology in transport to reduce the emissions. I'm not talking about only the electric vehicle. Obviously, in this process, India is a large country. We need to have a different kind of technology as well. But I'm saying that there should be one dedicated, empowered agencies which can support these new technologies. So these agencies can support developing charging infra both through private and public sectors, on an equal footing. At the same time, I would also like to have someone forming a voluntary EV user associations who can help in creating awareness among the different users, because awareness is something on which the work is not being done.
That was right from the middle of this week's episode, where we discuss what's holding back personal electric mobility in India and a lot more. Hello and a warm welcome to yet another episode on the Mission Shunya podcast. First things first, wherever you are, hope you are doing well. Stay safe, take care of yourself, and if possible, someone else too. As always, I am back with another interesting and insightful conversation on the podcast. One of the reasons why I'm excited to produce new and interesting content every other week is your support. For everyone who write in, drop a rating or review on the podcast platforms, the social media channels, a big thank you. A big thanks to all of you. In recent weeks, Mission Shunya is getting some good reviews from the Nordic. And it is just perfect coincidence that this week's episode has a small connect to the region. As you would have heard in the intro, electric mobility, particularly personal electric mobility, is the discussion topic for this week. Although we have references to the Indian policy context in the conversation like FAME, GST, etc., it is very insightful because we discuss the issue from three angles. First, what is it about the mindset of people that is required to enable the shift to personal electric mobility? Second, the narrative around the policy and the communication from the government agencies, and why is it essential from that perspective for both the manufacturers and the general public? And finally, we debunk a few of the myths around the transition to electric mobility with a reference to other countries as well. So, to lead us into that, I am joined today by an expert whom I have known for quite some time now, a very good communicator, which I'm sure you'll find out soon. So, who's the guest for this week?
I'm Awadhesh, and I lead the EV charging infrastructure for Fortum in India. And Fortum is a Finnish energy utility company based out of Helsinki, Finland.
So, as a leader in this sector, globally, in fact, you have been operating in India for quite some time. I should say that you are an early mover in the space, setting up infrastructure for e-mobility in India. So from your view, if I were to ask you from a personal viewpoint, what do you think is holding back the adoption of personal electric mobility in India?
Yeah, Girish, this is a very good question. And, I would say in order to understand this, we need to first decipher what are the enablers for electric mobility adoption as personal or commercial, light or heavy vehicle, as these are just subset of this larger universe of electric mobility.
Correct.
So if all the levers of electric mobility falls in place, I believe it will translate into adoption by all segments. See, the world is grappling with impact of rising global temperature currently. And locally as well, cities and urban cities are experiencing severe pollution. So in fact, these two in combination playing havoc with the humanity itself. The former is threatening the survival of Homo sapiens, whereas the latter affects the health on a daily basis, for us in terms of the lungs disease and all.
Correct.
And energy generation and transportation has to take the larger blame, because of this. And so decarbonization of these two elements is very, very important, and it has taken the priority in order to survive. As far as decarbonization of energy generation is concerned, how we are doing it, it is getting at much faster rate because we have adopted the solar, the wind, the hydro, and this is going at a full pace.
Correct.
However, decarbonization of transport, you would understand, is very complex. When I say complex, because still it is dominated by fossil fuels, particularly the road and aviation. With the railway has almost been electrified. Earlier, the railway used to be driven by the steam engine, later on, by the diesel. But globally, the railway has been fully electrified. So that leaves the scope for road transport and aviation to get electrified or get rid of the fossil fuels. And that's where comes the importance of the electrification of the personal mobility. So electrifying aviation using battery still seems to be very high, I would say the tough propositions. Whereas the road transport with light duty vehicles dominating the space is a good candidate case for getting electrified using battery. Having said so, it is very interesting to take note, Girish, that light duty vehicles have been present for more than 100 years.
Correct.
This is very important to take note of. Once it used to have, in fact, electric vehicle used to have one third of market share in US market, in the early 20th century. But it got killed with the invention of the ice and discovery of oil fields. Because the latter, the ice and the discovery of oil fields, gave huge convenience to us, both in terms of economy as well as the use. So electric vehicles got left behind. And how it happened again? So when the oil shock happened during the 70s, US took the first step to reignite electrification of vehicles.
True.
Despite that, electrification of the road transport could not move much ahead before Tesla took the decisive step in these directions. And then, especially during the last 10 years, Europe and China and US taking the lead, electrification of vehicle has been gaining momentum. And as you understand, recently, if we go by the International Energy Agency's outlook on the EV, Europe has, for the first time, taken over China in terms of number of sales of the electric vehicle. So here I would like to mention, effort of Europe in particular, which has pushed OEMs to go for the zero emission vehicles because they are putting a very stringent emission norms. Besides, the different countries in Europe, they are offering various incentives to promote EVs and disincentives to discourage buyers to go for the ICE vehicles. And additionally, many of the leading European countries have made a target also that between 2025 to 2040, depending upon few countries, they have decided that they will go full electric as far as road transport is concerned. No more ICE vehicles beyond this period. These are the enablers, which has provided the scale to the battery as well as the vehicle manufacturer, because they require a scale to bring down the cost. To increase the efficiency of the vehicles, the scale is important.
True.
Now, apart from this, what happens, Girish, is that any new technology has generally follows a cycle. You might be aware of this law of diffusion of innovation.
Correct.
So, law of diffusion of innovation is practically a kind of a bell curve where the first 17% or 16% falls into the innovator and early adapter category, right? Especially the innovator is 2.5%, and then 13.5% is the early adapters, followed by the early majority, and then the laggards. So this 16% is very crucial because these are the set of people who are willing to bet on new technology. They feel pride in experiencing a new technology and giving feedback. They feel that they are associated, they are contributing in development of these new technologies. And this is how the manufacturers improve the product over a period of time. And then it is adopted by the early majority, who forms bulk of the market, that is 34%, when the product becomes mainstream. So this is the background in which we need to understand what holds back the personal electric mobility in India. In India also, ultimately the EV, being a new technology product, has to go through this innovation curve. But there would be a difference of timing, because the various phase of the timing would be very shorter, because both OEMs and customer, we have the advantage of learning from progress made by the different or by the different global players. So we started our EV journey in just real sense 2 3 years back, but we need to give more time, and I personally feel that it should be 3 4 years from now, when EV in personal mobility would be mainstream. So having said so, when I'm saying that whether anything is holding back the adoption of personal electric mobility, I personally feel no. This is progressing. This is progressing as it should have been, because with this new technology, new product, it will have its own suspicions, own constraints, own inhibitions amongst the different minds of different stakeholders. But this will be a matter of 3 4 years time from now, when you'd find that EV, and with the background which I have given to you, is that EV will become the mainstream in the personal mobility.
The way you put EVs in terms of, as a comparison in terms of the technology adoption curve, is very interesting. I mean, that gives a better perspective rather than just saying the narrative that we are just 3 4 years away, because you nicely built on the narrative by comparing to how it's happened in Europe and other countries, and then you kind of justified by saying like India is also on the right curve, so it's just a matter of time before we hit that inflection point, if I were to put it that way. So that's really nice, and it's a nice little way to say that we are not really lagging behind this in India, but it's just going to be a matter of time. So with that interesting background on this, personal electric mobility, like you briefly mentioned, you touched upon that and how it's transitioned in US, Europe, China, is all about a little bit of shift in terms of the mindset of people. Because although society can lay the platform and enable everything else, but unless someone is really convinced, you did mention about International Energy Agency's number. So recently they also, in their landmark report for net zero, said that behavioral change is going to be one key aspect in enabling people to get to net zero. So that is even more crucial in terms of mobility, because it's personal mobility is driven by personal choice. What's your opinion on that? How do you think mindset shift will enable people to adopt EVs?
Yeah, thank you, Girish. I mean, this is interesting. I would say very interesting point. The mindset shift. See, any change needs time,
Correct.
and any behavior which has been conditioned over a very long time is very difficult to do away with. Now, imagine the ICE vehicles. This has been with us for more than 100 years. We have been conditioned. We don't blink our eyes when we go and decide to buy any vehicles. We don't blink our eyes that where would I get the gasoline tank filled in, because you see, adequate number of the petrol stations, diesel stations, the CNG everywhere across the city,
Correct.
or even if you travel along the highways. So this has become a part of our behavior which has been conditioned over 100 years. It's very difficult to do away with that. Here, I would like to bring some philosophy here from the behavioral psychology. You might be knowing Mr. B.F. Skinner. He was the behavioral psychologist during the 1904 to 1990. 1990 he died. From his theory, we learn that behavior is the result of the rewards and punishments associated with that behavior. So means any behavior is a product of rewards and punishments which goes with that behavior. So essentially, he identified 4 conditioning: positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, punishment, and extensions. What does it mean? Positive and negative reinforcement strengthens a particular behavior, as you can very much visualize, making it more likely to occur.
Correct.
And punishment and extension weakens a particular behavior. It reduces the behavior. So this is what we require in personal electric mobility as well. Positive reinforcement can be given by way of fiscal and non-fiscal incentives, whereas negative reinforcement could be by linking the tax on vehicle with degree of emission from the vehicles. So like the GST, give you an example. GST at 5% for EV is a positive reinforcement,
Correct.
whereas GST of 28% to 50% on ICE is a negative reinforcement. Because you encourage the people to go, if you buy electric, you'll be paying less tax. If you buy ICE, you'll be paying more tax. Waiving of registration and road tax, these are the positive reinforcements. Despite all these positive reinforcement coming in the form of GST, lesser GST, waiving of registrations, road tax, why it has not able to draw the desired response from the individual customers? So there, I believe the FAME 2 should take a larger responsibility for this one. What it has conveyed, especially on the four-wheeler personal mobility, it sends the message that the private or the personal mobility is not their priority of the government.
Correct.
Now, important part to remember is that the four-wheeler personal segment is the largest segment of vehicles for all stakeholders. See, in four-wheeler segment, OEM's fortune, I would say, hinges on how this segment of the customer behaves. If they do not pick up the vehicles, the OEM shivers, right? During this COVID, we have got these demonstrations. When the customers did not buy the car, the OEM suffered.
Correct.
The overall sales declined. So this is an important segment. And you are saying that this is not a priority for us. So what the messaging is that since the government is saying this is not required to be serviced, then why OEM would take extra pain to go out of their comfort zone? They don't have any incentive. So I am of the view that the FAME 2 should allow demand incentive on EV, irrespective of its use, whether it's for personal or it's for commercial. And this is particularly true post-COVID, when people would prefer to travel in personal vehicles. So I feel the larger problem is coming from the, I would say, misdirected message from the FAME 2, where the government is not bringing the personal mobility, particularly on the four-wheeler segment I'm talking about here, into the fold of the FAME 2. Whether they would have given much boost or not, that's a matter of, that's a moot point. But the signal, at least the messaging the government is giving to the OEM that the personal car segment is not my priority, and so OEM feels fine. If the personal car is not your priority, then I have to serve only 35,000 cars on the commercial.
True.
So this is, I would say, where something has to be corrected before this becomes a very clear, focused messaging on the EV. I mean,
that's interesting. That's interesting to know that communication from the government is not really convincing the public. As you rightly said, the FAME 2 policy by the government is kind of prioritizing shared mobility, vehicles used for public transportation but not for private use. On the other hand, I think the narrative from the government is also tilting towards two-wheelers and three-wheelers. So what's your take on that?
See, as we understand, India has very clearly four distinct segments in the vehicle: two-wheelers, three-wheelers, four-wheeler passenger cars, and the commercial vehicle. If India has to contribute towards the climate change and to fight the local level pollutions, each segment needs to get electrified.
Correct.
And I'm not in favor of fixing any inter se priority between these segments by government for electrifications, particularly when automobile sector is completely in private sector. I'm not aware that the government agency is involved in manufacturing of the whether the car or the bus or the two-wheeler or three-wheelers. So it's purely dominated by the private sector. So once it is dominated by the private sector, this should be left to the industry and the market. What government needs to do? Government needs to provide the policy framework, and that framework needs to be built on larger goals like climate change and the local level pollutions, import of oils, and that's it. After all, it is the interplay between end customer and the OEM which decide what gets sold in the market. Now, what is happening here? The government is dictating that four-wheeler is not my priority, private is not priority, only two-wheelers and three-wheelers is my priority, right?
Correct.
Whereas, let's see, it's a fact that two-wheeler is dominating the market. I'm talking of overall automobile sector.
True.
And that is expected also, because we have a larger populations where the purchasing capacity is less. So obviously people would be trying to go for mobility, then they would go for the two-wheeler as a personal mobility options.
Correct.
But does that mean that this is low-hanging fruit as it is generally made us to believe? I don't think so. See what happens. The incremental cost in each segment is almost same in terms of percentage. So let's say two-wheelers, if it is normal ICE two-wheelers is costing around 60,000, a good product lithium ion based scooter, currently scooter, I'm not talking about even the bike, because there is only probably one manufacturer who has showcased one bike on electric vehicles. Otherwise, most of the manufacturers are selling the scooters.
Correct.
And the difference is almost 80 to 90% over excess price over the competitor ICE vehicle. Now similar thing is in the four wheeler as well. In the four wheeler also you have a vehicles which is available at almost 60 to 70% extra price over the equivalent segment in the four wheeler segment as well. And you can take any example, whether you take Hyundai Kona, whether you take Nexon, whether you take MZ-ZS, corresponding to their respective or equivalent product in the ICE, the price of this vehicle is around 60% to 70% higher.
Correct.
Right? So incremental cost in terms of percentage is same, right? In both the segment.
Correct.
So I believe the customer of four-wheeler segment is favorably positioned, to spend this additional cost. Why? Because of their larger paying capacity,
True.
as well as they have a larger borrowing capacity.
Correct.
And incidentally, and I think in India, most of the people, individual buyers I'm talking about, they are buying the vehicles, whether it's a two-wheelers or four-wheeler, on borrowed money,
Correct.
the bank financed money or NBFC's financed money. And another important aspect in terms of two-wheelers and four-wheelers. See, our narrative on the method of electrification has to be right. Currently, this is very, very confusing and very skewed. I tell you how. And in fact, my view is that this is where the most of the confusion also lies, that the two-wheeler is probably gaining ground and four-wheeler is not. I will try to give you some data that will help you understand that this narrative is wrong.
Sure.
See, when we talk about the constraint, challenges like high cost, lack of charging infra, that this is plaguing the EV sector, what battery chemistry comes to your mind? It is lithium ion.
Exactly.
It's not the lead acid. Now, whereas when you talk about numbers, particularly in two-wheelers and three-wheelers, the lead acid battery based EV gets mixed up with the lithium ion. So I give you one example. In FY21, it is publicly said by a couple of official agencies is that around 150,000 units have been sold for two-wheelers, whereas around 5,000 to 6,000 units of four-wheelers only have been sold. Right? Now, this is how this is positioning, 150,000 on two-wheelers and only 5,000 to 6,000 on four-wheelers. Anybody would say, yes, two-wheelers is a huge market.
Correct.
But when you break down this, when you drill down this, what is happening? First of all, most of the official agencies are not giving you the data based on the lithium ion and lead acid sales on the two-wheeler side.
Correct.
Very, very, you'll have to dig deep. You have to do a hard research to find this data, because I have gone through the Vahan dashboard, which is a Government of India dashboard, where you get the details of all the vehicles which is getting registered. You see only the electric vehicles, and their lead acid and lithium ion, it is not mentioned there. Similarly, on the site of SMEV as well, you will find a total number of vehicles sold, right?
Correct.
However, when you dig deep, you would find that in last year, about 30 to 40,000 lithium ion based two wheelers was sold. Now you compare this 30 to 40,000 lithium ion with the 5,000 to 6,000 four wheelers. Now you compare, the narrative is entirely different. Why? Because if you compare this 30 40,000 of the two wheeler sales vis-a-vis 22 million total sales of automobile in two wheeler side, it constitutes around 0.18%, approximately 0.2%.
Correct.
Similarly, if you compare this 5,000 to 6,000 four wheeler electric vehicle against about 2.8 million four wheeler total sales, it is also constituting around 0.2 to 0.3%.
Yeah.
So, in terms of penetration, on a like to like chemistry, both the segment are making the similar adoption. So I personally feel this narrative has to be right. The narrative is currently flawed, where we compare this 150,000 or 200,000 of two wheelers with the 5,000 of four wheelers. This narrative is wrong. So that's where I believe that two wheelers and four wheelers, and I am of consistent view that four wheelers probably would be the much better position, as I explained earlier, because of the higher paying capacity of that segment, because of the larger willingness of the bank or financial institutions for this particular segment to lend money, and the advantage of the income tax act, where the government has given 150,000 rupees rebate on the income tax if you borrow the vehicle to buy the electric vehicle. So obviously for a price of 1 lakh you will not be getting a 150,000 interest,
Correct.
but for a price of 10 lakh or 12 lakh rupees you will be borrowing, then you will be getting the 150,000 returns a rebate as well. So I think this narrative of two wheelers, three wheelers has to be corrected in terms of the battery chemistry, and then you will see in the right perspective the two wheelers and four wheelers. And I feel, based on the data, as I have explained to you, that two wheelers and four wheelers is making equal, adoption in the market, and this is in line with that innovation curve.
Exactly. It's really interesting to understand this from a data perspective. Like, as you rightly said, having the right set of data and looking at the data in the right framework, you can actually compare where the market is going. And the way you summarize this clearly shows that you are a very active player in the market. And considering you have significant experience, you're looking at the right set of parameters, and then saying that the overall narrative can be changed to enable better adoption. But at the same time, the narrative is that the progress is on the right track. So that's a very good way to summarize this discussion around the narrative of the policymakers in enabling this shift to electric mobility. Now, we spoke about mindset shift and the narrative building. Considering that Photom as an organization has like significant experience in the Nordic, where you are a leading player. So, can you briefly summarize how that transition happened in the Nordic? Do you see any comparisons, or what's your view on that?
Yeah, I think this is important because we come from I mean, as a company we come from the Nordic, and we must share with the audience, with the people, with the stakeholders, that how it has transitioned there. See, overall you will find the European Union is pushing the EV through its regulations on emission from the ICE vehicles. They have a very stringent emission norm.
Correct.
So basically, this is the major push for them for the transitions towards the electric vehicles. But in addition to the European Unions, the different countries are also promoting the EV in a very structured way. And before I come to how our policymakers are doing it, I would like to give you an example of Norway, how Norway has done it. See, the climate policy has been the major driving force, or rather one of the major driving force in Norwegian politicians' commitment to EVs. From the 1990 onwards itself, electric vehicles have been high on their political agenda.
Okay.
So that resulted in introductions of the various incentives, that is necessary to meet the market challenges and encourage also, because even the early adopters has to get certain incentives to test the new technology, isn't it?
Correct.
So that's where they had a very interest in the local air quality as well, and they remember Norwegian electrification is completely driven by the hydro, and that is a completely CO2 free.
Correct.
So, and between the 2000 2010, that is very crucial. Between 2000 2010, Industrial development was their political driving force
Okay.
because they wanted to establish a national EV industry. They established an organization called, initially it was called Innova, now it is called Transnova. So they established this agency in 2009, and the purpose of this agency was to support testing and expansion of new technologies to reduce the climate gas emission from electric mobility in Norway. So all the new technologies which can support reducing the climate gas emissions, so they supported the hydrogen, they supported the plug-in hybrid, they supported electric, but then finally they settled with the electric vehicles. So this new, and plus this organization also ensured that they will finance setting up the charging station on a larger scale,
Okay.
and they made it neutral to anyone, whether it is a private or the public. Their modus operandi was very clear. They identified the stretch. They did not support in the cities because they say the cities, if we promote the electric vehicle, automatically the public charging infrastructure will be economical.
Okay.
But on the highways where we have to encourage the people to go and drive, they started giving subsidy, a capex subsidy.
Okay.
Unlike our country where we give a 70% of the electric vehicle supply equipment cost and no cost towards electrification. So they said that no, nothing doing. Entire charging infrastructure cost can be borne with a ceiling, with a 30,000 euro, with a ceiling that can be supported by or subsidized by this agency Transnova, and irrespective of whether you are a private sector or a public sector, anybody can get this one if they meet the certain laid down criteria.
Okay.
Another important thing happened in that country is that electric vehicle user association was developed, and this is very active user association. This is one of its kind in the world.
Okay.
This plays an important role. So what they do, they support their users, members, to get most out of the vehicles by compiling all the information which is available in the market and making those informations on the charging facilities, to recruiting the drivers, to training the drivers, disseminating different activities. They facilitated knowledge transfer as well. So they played a very active role in creating the awareness in the existing as well as the larger prospective users. So this was on the, I would say, the organizations, how they started, how they work, but they also started giving the economic incentives, like the exemption from the vehicle tax, the registration tax. In terms of, they also made the public investment in the charging infrastructure, as I said, so that the range issue is reduced. So all these things made the electric vehicle popular with the larger shares of the car buyers in Norway. And today, say year 2021, in the month of March, it was 75% annual sales was on the electric.
Wow.
So this is the achievement of Norway. And as I have explained to you, this is possible when you have a very focused and very, I would say, very structured policy making, very focused and very directional. Unfortunately, in India, we are not moving with that kind of clarity and that kind of a structure in place.
That's a nice little short summary of how this transition happened. As you rightly said, there are two sides to this. One is enabling the ecosystem to develop, that is, enabling the OEMs and charging infrastructure players to kind of set up the infrastructure. And then on the other side, demand side, enabling people to purchase the vehicles by providing the right incentives. And those are interesting numbers. I think Norway and Nordic region in general is kind of year on year sales is increasing significantly, and the penetration numbers like 75% is really phenomenal. So that's really good, and hopefully this can actually, lessons from this can actually be taken, and players like you can bring it to the Indian market, and the progress can be made. Now, on a final note, I kind of have to ask this. We spoke about the narrative, we spoke about the mindset shift that is required to transitioning to electric mobility, but there is also this aspect of it which you actually deal with this on a regular basis, that is dealing with the myths and misconceptions in the market. And by being an early player, you deal with it even more aggressively. So, like for example, people complain that there are not many charging stations available. So, why should I buy a EV? But globally, even like IEA numbers say that most of the charging happens at home. So, how do you go about debunking the myths and clarifying the misconceptions?
Yeah. So before I address that, because I have been speaking about these myths both in the, I would say, webinar and conferences amongst the industry players, as well as within the students community as well, because I believe that the students are the future users of the vehicles, and at least they should grow on, or they should develop the right, or they should take a decision based on the right information instead of the false narrative or false myth. But before I touch base on that one, I would like to take liberty to touch upon one important point on the narrative side. When I was discussing,
Sure.
I forgot to mention that, you know, how our policymakers can contribute in building confidence, amongst the public. See, as you have just now might have experienced through the examples of the Norway, that it is very important that the narratives, proper or suitable narratives, are developed by the policymakers. That is very, very crucial.
Correct.
The impact of climate change and the local level pollutions, as I have said, that this should be on high on the agenda of our policymakers. Unfortunately, till this point of time, this is not on high of the on the agenda. Yes, we have the muted references of the Paris climate, under the nationally determined contributions of reducing the carbon intensity by 35% from the level of 2005. But these are very muted. When I'm talking of the policymakers, I'm talking of a national level consensus that yes, the pollution, local level pollutions, and the climate change is very much required, is a part of the development agenda, and all the policy regarding the electric vehicle should draw from there. So this is something, where I believe that, because see, currently the policies are coming in bits and pieces, so that will not lead us to the way the Nordic countries or European countries have done it. I give you one example. So FAME 2 and GST are very, very important policy framework, but this requires to be supported, strengthened.
Correct.
So what I would prefer, from the government side or the policymaker side, that if we can have one overarching agencies like Transnova of Norway, who is empowered and who is given the enough fund to support the new technology in transport to reduce the emissions. I'm not talking about only the electric vehicle. Obviously, in this process, India is a large country. We need to have a different kind of technology as well. But I'm saying that there should be one dedicated, empowered agencies which can support these new technologies. So these agencies can support developing charging infra both through private and public sectors. On an equal footing. Currently, it is very, I would say, fragmented and very isolated kind of an initiatives. At the same time, I would also like to have someone forming a voluntary EV user associations who can help in creating awareness among the different users, because awareness is something on which the work is not being done. So this is on the one important piece of the narrative by the policymakers. Having said so, I come to your original questions, that how do we debunk this myth in order to be a smooth transition. See, as a customer, what do we need? We need a good product at affordable price.
Yes.
And in the respect of electric vehicle, that product at affordable price also requires to be charged, right?
Correct.
But that charging should happen at a place, at a price, and a time of the choice of user of the EV. It should not be dictated by the, that it should be home or public. It should be at the place and the price and time of the choice of the owner and user of EV.
Correct.
Please remember, as far as charging is concerned, on the charging, we always say that home charging occupies the 70% or 80%, or maximum charging happens on 70% or 80%. You have also given this example, quoting IEA recent reports.
Yes.
So please understand, currently the IEA is also getting the data, most of the data from the developed countries like Europe and USA. And also understand now the innovation curve, the early adopters and the innovators.
Correct.
Now it is going to the mass market, right? Norway has entered the mass market now. And similarly, other countries are also now gradually entering. Still, the France, Germany, UK, still on the, I would say, on the left side of the curve.
Correct.
So what happens? Invariably, these innovators and early adopters are in Europe and US as very high, income group. They are generally dwelling in a single bungalow. So they have a dedicated garage, and these countries are, cold countries, so they have the inherent feature or the advantage of having the electrical points in their garage as well, because the ICE vehicle also require heating during the extreme cold weather, right?
True.
So they have the advantage of charging at home, and this is how the electric vehicle has started there. But please understand, India is not Europe, India is not US.
Correct.
India is more like a China. And if in the same IA report, if you dig deep and if you see the China's emphasis on the charging infrastructure, their emphasis has been on the public charging.
Correct.
And this I support from the Norway, because currently when we are expanding a public charging in Europe as well. And there we are seeing that when the housing associations are concerned, many of the people do not have the dedicated parking space. So where do they charge? So they require a public charging place. Similar is the case in India. Now, so my only point is that in India, we cannot borrow exactly in the similar fashion, and we say that 70 to 80% charging will happen at home. I feel probably no. Most of the charging in India would happen either at workplace or at public place. Very few people. Actually, even the government of India data says, even in the urban cities, 60 to 70% of the cars, I'm talking about the cars, are parked on street without authorized parking. So it means only 20-30% of the owners have a dedicated car park. Yes, the initial set of people, those innovators and early adopters, some of them, I'm not saying 100% of that 16% bracket, some of them will have the luxury of having a dedicated garage and they can find charging at home. Perfect. But when you are talking about the mainstream of this EV being the mainstream, at that point of time, people would be requiring a public charging place to go and charge their vehicles. So, as far as four-wheeler is concerned, the public charging is definitely one of the important elements. And I firmly believe that the charging network has to proceed before the sale of the car happens on the larger scale. Because as a consumer, as I said in the earlier part of the discussions, that we have been conditioned over 100 years that we don't blink our eyes where to fill the gasoline tank of our ICE vehicles.
Correct.
People expect this because now behavior has there. Now, if you want to change it, you have to have a similar kind of a stimuli. And how do you bring that stimuli? By creating the charging infrastructure, which brings the visibility, which gives the visibility to the end consumer. So when they go and buy an electric car, whether it's a CCS or Ceremo or a DC001, they don't blink their eyes. They said, fine, I have seen the charging infrastructure at Connaught Place. I have seen the charging infrastructure at Rajouri Garden. I have seen the charging infrastructure at Gurgaon, and I don't have any problem. I will go and I'll fill the battery there. So for me, this is on the four-wheeler segment. Regarding the two-wheeler, if the people are saying that the public charging infrastructure is a bottleneck, then I am saying probably they are again giving a false narrative, because for two-wheelers, currently there is not much huge case of the public charging, because vehicle requires to be charged at 0.1C or 0.2C. So it means for 2 kilowatt hour of battery, you would be requiring around 4 hours, 5 hours to remain stranded at the public place. That is not possible. So there, the charging can happen at home, because this requires a 15 amp socket, and 4 hours, 3 hours is fine. So in two wheelers, probably the home charging can happen. And why it is not happening, despite everybody if everybody is having access to the electricity, probably this is a matter to be explored. But as far as four-wheeler is concerned, I clearly see that a public charging, a robust public charging, ubiquitous public charging is a sine qua non for adoption of the electric vehicle in the ultimate scenario.
I again really like the way you put data into the entire narrative. So, again, with data and comparisons to different markets, and as you rightly said, comparing India to China will be probably more appropriate because those are mass market adopters rather than the early adopters or innovators like the US or Europe. So, that gives the narrative a real meaningful outlook. So, with that, it kind of clarifies that yes, public charging infrastructure has to be set up, and once the setup is there and it's rolling, probably we will see more adoption in the electric mobility. That kind of circles back to the entire question which we started the conversation. How do we enable the mindset shift, and how do we build confidence in the public mindset? So that's a wonderful little wrap on how we can get to that level by enabling infrastructure precede the rollout of electric vehicles. So it has been a wonderful conversation, and I'm sure it is very clearly evident that you are an active player, and all that you kind of mention are really backed by solid data, cross country studies, on ground data. So it really builds confidence in the narrative and very clear on what needs to happen, how it will happen, and what are the enablers. So thank you very much for taking time and joining me on the podcast.
Thank you, Girish. And it was pleasure always talking to you because your questions are very incisive. When I say incisive, it provokes thinking. You need to be very spontaneous, and you need to be very genuine in bringing out the data and the facts. So thank you, and it's always pleasure to be part of your podcast.
Likewise, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I should give listeners a little background that we have known each other for quite some time now, and we have had multiple discussions around this topic, and it continues to evolve over the years. So that's a very positive sign.
Thank you.
And with that, it's a wrap on this episode. I hope you found it very useful. You can follow Awadhesh Jha on LinkedIn. The link to connect will be available in the show notes section of the podcast and on the website missionshunya.com. He's definitely a wonderful person to discuss ideas around mobility, and I'm in fact very lucky to pick his brain from time to time. I am sure you got a few action items to take from this week's episode as well. Remember, there is no better time than now to invest in your new electric vehicle. By the way, if you own one or if you bought a new one recently, let me know how you feel. Maybe your reviews could come up on the social media pages of Mission Shunya or another episode on mobility down the line. Finally, subscribe, rate, review, and share Mission Shunya across your network. Remember, it's just a 30-second act of kindness. I will be back in 2 weeks' time with a brand new episode. Until then, this is Girish Shivakumar signing off. And as always, thank you for listening.